Well, I can only do that. But let me just start off by evoking Brother James Baldwin when he says that I love America more than any other country. In fact, to paraphrase him, this is the only country as I know, and so therefore I insist on the right to criticize America perpetually. Particularly as a black man, I'm going to criticize it with regards to race and other sort of systemic issues. In terms of Tammy Kemp, her embrace at the end of the trial was very much inappropriate. See, on the one hand, it's okay for a citizen to embrace a defendant and or give a Bible to this defendant. In fact, she told the defendant, Amber Geiger, to sort of begin her sort of reformation by reading John 3:16, right? God so loved the world, etc., etc., etc. And this was inappropriate because there is a such thing as the separation between church and state. And so in her robe, in her official capacity, she in fact sort of asked to reform or share her religion and whatever with this particular group. So that was certainly inappropriate. But there's something more fundamental happening here. You see, there's a selective, if you will, forgiveness process. Black folk tend not to forgive other black folk for types of crimes like these.
Yeah, I don't think, if she was black, I don't think she'd do it.
Oh, and absolutely. And white folk, and I don't mean this in any harsh way, but my brother Remedy said, please keep it raw and real. White folk don't often forgive black folk for types of crimes like this. And so what is this about this sort of selective sort of application of forgiveness? Now, some people might argue that if you sort of harbor anger and sort of frustration, that it worsens our cardiovascular conditions, and so therefore we must forgive sort of white supremacists and white racists. Well, I tell you, if you want to forgive, you want to improve your health conditions, then let's start changing the food deserts that we live in with all the carryout spots that characterize our main corridors, the main arteries in our community. Let's start thinking about the zoning board if you want to get good health. Let's look at more recreational space in Black and Latinx communities. So I want to put that aside here and make this point. Some might say that it's about religion. It's about, in fact, you think of scriptures such as the book of Mark, sort of the book of Matthews, in fact, when in the book of Matthews, it says that, for if you forgive other people who sin against you, then your Father in heaven shall forgive you. Or sort of the book of Ephesians in chapter 4:32, when it says, be kind and compassionate to one another because God ultimately will forgive you. Black folk got to realize that there should be a separation between sort of forgiveness and absolving someone of their wrongdoing.
Yeah, especially because if you don't feel, it's one thing to verbally say, I forgive you, but if you don't feel that person actually deserves to be absolved, then who is it really serving?
Absolutely. Jesus the Nazareth was killed by the Romans. And in fact, some would argue, some of us who are deep in this says that Jesus looked more like you and I. And that he was killed not on a cross, but he was lynched on a tree, right, metaphorically. And so when we think about this, Jesus didn't say in the end of his life, I forgive the Romans. In fact, he spoke very little bit about the Romans. That was for someone else to do, to sort of lend forgiveness. Jesus was upset. In fact, Jesus was in pain. Jesus was dying. And so, when we sort of practice this formulaic response of forgiveness, we indemnify white folk. In other words, we make white folk feel good and feel as though that they don't own the responsibility of systemic and white supremacy. So we let them off the hook.
What do you think it is? I mean, there's an argument that on one hand, it's the weaponization of Christianity. Like this is deeply rooted since slavery. On the other hand, there's also the idea that, well, this is another example of seeking white validation. You know what I mean? And this is for everybody if you want to chime in, but what do y'all think? What do you think this really is? What do you think is
We've been beaten to submission. We've been mentally and physically whipped into submission now. And we're especially coming from mentally because we've been served this image of a white God that automatically puts you in a place of inferiority. So seeing that, and when we're dealing with the Caucasian people, you automatically feeling inferior, and then you end up, the injustices are being done to you, but you feel bad for the people that are doing the injustice to you. It's submission.
Yeah. Absolutely. We absolve people, particularly forms of white terrorism against our community, we absolve the act, but it's something deeper than just the act. See, I think, therefore I am. First, sin is, as the Bible says, if you want to get holy roly on me, the Bible says that sin is first committed in thought. So you can forgive the act, but we need to change the mindset of America. See, white supremacy is an ideology. So you can forgive Amber Geiger less than a second, and I'm a former police officer, as you all know, and we're taught cover and concealment. She opened the door, she assumed it was her apartment after working a 15-hour shift. She started 7 a.m. in the morning, got off at 10 p.m. And she was sexting, right? She was texting a married man about sex relations, right? So she wasn't so mentally fatigued as one would argue.
Right.
But she could have been...
If anything, her endorphins were on point there.
They were on fleek, as they would say, right? And so she could have simply backed out of the apartment and called for backup, right? But she describes in her affidavit that she saw this dark figure, this silhouette of a man,
That's
right?
She needed to see. Dark.
Right? And so she, and the insulting thing about this is that the end of her trial, after she plays Goldilocks on the stage, or on the stand rather. I should say on the stage, because it was a hell of a performance.
Oh yeah, it was.
At the end of her trial, she claimed stand your ground, the castle doctrine, which argues that in fact she has no right to retreat when she is within her own sort of God-given and sort of her home or her vehicle, etc., when she was in fact in his home. So her and her attorneys had already sort of drew out this sort of racial narrative. They wanted people to see the vulnerable white female with the dark silhouette, beyond imaginable size of a black man, who was sitting at his table with a spork, eating ice cream. 12 to 15 feet away. And so what happens is that white supremacy, and we have to continue to engage this, white supremacy socializes us, it conditions us to almost instinctually forgive. And again, this forgiveness is selective. We only forgive white racists.
Do you think this is some people argue that, well, forgiveness is the best thing to do because when you do it, it helps everyone. And where are we going to be if we don't forgive? We're going to be bitter and angry and stuff like that. Do you think, what do you say to that argument?
Well, let me just say to you, and I totally appreciate the question. I get that question quite often. Forgiveness without mutual atonement. In fact, black folk don't necessarily have, the victim doesn't have anything to atone for. But forgiveness without atonement is just cheap grace. It's cheap grace. She doesn't atone for what she's done. Now, by the way, we thought that this was an accident. This was just an errant, bad decisions on this officer's part. She was fatigued, etc. But then later we discovered that she has these very racist sort of social media accounts and content that both she initiated and that she responded to. So it tells us that there is some racial animus. So now you ask me, Jay, you ask me, Remedy, do I have a problem with this? I absolutely have a problem with this. When the brother, Brant, gets on the stand during his sort of victim impact witness statement, etc., and he says, I love you for a person. This is white supremacy at its most sickest stage, when you are told that this person is a rabid racist.
And you see the messages.
Now, it's not just the brother. It's, the father, the father said, Bertram said that he wanted to be friends with her. The mother said that we were raised as Christians, and we didn't hear anything from the sister. In fact, the mother's name is Allison, and we didn't hear anything from the sister or the daughter, whose name is Alyssa. But you know what? I'm a Garner. I love Ewa Garner, Eric Garner's wife, who said, "No, I'm not forgiving you.
That's right.
I'm hurting, and now you deprived me of my breadwinner. How should I forgive? You should forgive your damn self."
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I just think that there's a significant sickness, and people just jump to it and praise because how graceful Brent was in his forgiveness. I'm not saying that we can't personally grieve. I don't want to dictate how this family grieves, but also when it deals with this type of magnitude of race, then we should also be held accountable for what significance this means for the greater cause.
We're speaking with Kalfani Ture, and of course we have a few people in the space right now. having this discussion. Feel free to call us up and join us, 203-562-9430, 203-562-9430. And something else that seems like when, when it comes to black people in regards to this situation, whether it's Martin Luther King politically, or even if it's a situation like this, we're supposed to demonstrate this nobility. We're supposed to be the ones that show this feeling of, of meekness almost. You know
That's
what
right.
I mean? Where is that coming from? Where does that I don't want to say Martin Luther King began that, but for me, the furthest I can go back to, as far as in the books, the history books, is when you have Martin Luther King saying, they could throw rocks, they could throw whatever, we're non-violent.
Absolutely. Well, let me just say that I want to be careful here because I don't want to generalize. We have a lot of important allies who, in fact, would be designated as white. So it's not all white people. What I'm talking about is the ideology, white supremacy.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so what I want to say is not just about forgiveness. What you're pointing to is about a dance. You see, in the encounters with white supremacist people, whether they're actively supremacists or they don't know that they're supremacists, we are supposed to disabuse them of the idea that the ghetto stereotype applies to us. Mm-hmm. So we have to do what's called the dance. And sometimes time is not on your side. If the consequences of their stereotypical applications on you as a threat or as something other than conventional, or they have some kind of dystopian